Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the Idaho Public Television Endowment.
One of the things we have historically cared about in America is opportunity and the idea of the American dream. And for a lot of those kids growing up in my hometown, that is a joke. It is a cruel joke.
Coming up, I talk with Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist Nicholas Kristof. That's dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today has traveled to more than 150 countries, including some of the most unstable and dangerous ones in the world. With his words, he's brought to life shocking situations, sometimes pleading with his readers to pay more attention to conditions outside their own lives. For his work at the New York Times, both as a foreign correspondent and a columnist, Nicholas Kristof has won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and has been a finalist for that honor 7 times. He and his wife, Cheryl Wu Dunn, a writer who won a Pulitzer with him, have written 2 books about international issues, A Path Appears and the best-selling Half the Sky. Both were turned into documentaries that aired on PBS. For his next book, Kristof has turned his attention closer to home, indeed to his hometown of Yamhill, Oregon. He's writing about poverty and social conditions in our country, following the stories of several of the families he grew up with in Oregon. I spoke with Mr. Kristof about that and other topics when he was in Boise in October 2018 to address the fall conference of the Idaho Women's Charitable Foundation. Hundreds of attendees from all over the state had come together to discuss ways to combat homelessness. Well, first of all, welcome to Idaho, or I should say welcome back to Idaho, because as a Oregonian...
I feel like I'm almost home.
Yeah. You'd have to hitchhike.
If I sneak out and head toward Ontario, you'll understand.
But it gives you a good sense, I think, having grown up in Oregon, of what some of the custom, culture, and politics of a place like Idaho are. You know, I think it's...
Absolutely.
It's
I mean, also I'm from a part of Oregon that is actually a little more like Idaho politically and otherwise than a lot of Oregon.
Right, not like inside Portland. Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit. First, I want to ask you, you're going to be speaking to the Idaho Women's Charitable Foundation. What's your message for them regarding particularly, philanthropy and how to make the world a better place?
So it's that, we face at this time in our country a lot of sort of enormous problems with people who've been left behind. I think that since about the mid-1970s, we've made a series of policy errors that have been bad for the country, that other countries have gotten ahead of us, that we see this in terms of the working class in particular being left behind. And, there are no magic bullets, but I think that there are proven strategies that mitigate the problems, that make a difference, and that it's going to take some combination of government assistance and philanthropy to move the ball. And that, I'm thrilled that Boise cares about the issue of homelessness. The first thing we need to do is to pay attention, and that, clearly Idaho is doing that.
When you say there's some policy changes that have gotten us to where we are today, dating back to the 1970s, what are 1 or 2 of those policies that you would point to?
So I think one of the most basic things is that work has to pay better. If you adjusted the 1969 minimum wage for productivity and inflation, it'd be $22 an hour now. Now, $22 an hour is, that I think would price some people out of the market, but I think we could raise the minimum wage. I think we could tinker with the narrative of the country. I think the personal responsibility narrative began, in around the 1970s, and there's clearly something to it. I mean, clearly there are failures in personal responsibility. But I think if we're going to have that conversation, we also have to have a conversation about our collective social responsibility to address kids, especially who get left behind, who don't get adequate education, who are exposed to toxic environments at home. We fail those kids before they fail us. And so, yeah, let's have the personal responsibility conversation. Let's also talk about our own responsibility.
And that takes tax revenues to support a government program to do that.
It absolutely does. But one of the things that I find frustrating is that some of the interventions would actually save the public money down the road. We've dealt with drugs in the most expensive possible route through incarcerating people and spending $25,000 a year incarcerating them in a way that just leads to recidivism, that breaks up families, it removes male role models. And it is so frustrating that only 10% of Americans in addiction get access to drug treatment. We use a criminal justice toolbox, which has been spectacularly ineffective and is incredibly expensive, and we don't use the public health toolbox.
How, with the plethora of programs that are out there, can somebody vet or try and make sure that the program that they want to support is in fact above board?
I think we can minimize the problems by bringing a kind of investing mindset. We know that early childhood education really seems to make a profound difference in people's lives. You randomly assign one group of kids to an early childhood program and the other children are not, and the ones that randomly went to the early childhood program are less likely to become pregnant as teenagers, more likely to graduate from high school, less likely to be arrested as teenagers. As adults, they're more likely to own their homes, they're going to earn more money. I mean, the outcomes really do seem different, and I think one of the problems with our interventions to help poverty is that we don't start early enough, and it's an awful lot easier to help a troubled 3-year-old than a troubled 13-year-old. But I guess I'd also say that in venture capital, a lot of investments are going to go awry and aren't going to work out. And I think that inevitably there is going to be a certain amount of philanthropy that is going to go by. Helping people is harder than it looks.
Is there an organization that you recommend people go to when they're trying to know whether a nonprofit is good or not?
So one of the problems is that a lot of the organizations that vet tend to vet in terms of administrative expenses, the share of the total that goes to administration. And it's true that you don't want to give money just so somebody can build a marble lobby, but often administrative money is not waste. It's money that may make sure that kids are kept safe. I think people have gone a little overboard in terms of just trying to use things like Charity Navigator to avoid administrative expenses. And there is a website called GiveWellorg, which tries to it was started by some former hedge fund people who really try to find the most bang for the buck. And I think that they do a pretty good job.
And we see a lot of young people, which I think is great, getting involved, starting their own charities abroad. But in A Path Appears, you also say, the scattershot approach, is not necessarily the best. Buying uniforms here, helping with a water system here.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that every young person in high school or college wants to be a social entrepreneur and wants to found their own organization. And sometimes that's great, and some of these organizations are wonderful, but we need some followers. We need some people who will join an existing organization and sustain it and make it work. And there is kind of a problem when everybody wants to found their own little organization, and then it does great for 5 years, and then the person graduates, gets married, gets other interests, and it flounders. So I think we've gone a little overboard in this idea of everybody founding their own thing. And I tell young people, hey, be a follower.
How have you changed your reporting either in how you investigate sources or the topics that you choose, based on some of the issues that you've faced where you have endorsed either a person or an organization only then to find out that there's some problems behind them. How has that changed what you do or how you do it?
I think that has made me more wary of some of these success stories, or what appear to be success stories. So I think I've become more suspicious of some of those individual stories because they are so difficult to vet. I mean, one of the things I always do when I'm in the field, I always go in the field before I write about some organization. I always see it in the field, and I try to, if I get one person's story, then I talk to villagers near them to make sure that their version is the same as that person's. But you parachute into some village somewhere, working through a translator. I don't have great confidence that I'm always getting the right story, and yet I do like some of those individual stories of local people who have done these sort of amazing things. But it's
and when you write about them, you can move the needle.
Absolutely.
So that is an extra burden, trying to get it right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wrote about a doctor in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan. I've raised more than $1 million for his work, and that's thrilling on the one hand, but it's also a great responsibility because people are writing checks based on what I'm saying.
You've spent so much of your reporting life in other countries, and your writing life. Your next book is much closer to home and closer to Idaho.
Yeah.
It's about Oregon, where you grew up. Tell me a little bit about why you wanted to turn your gaze this direction now.
I felt that partly as a result of President Trump's election, partly as a result of seeing what was going on in my little hometown, population 1,000 in rural Oregon.
Yamhill?
Yamhill. And, that we had some enormous problems at home. And my hometown was one that had seen an enormous amount of progress in the early part of the 20th century. So when I was in high school, there were lots of my friends' parents who, growing up, didn't have electricity or plumbing, had really kind of lived at the margin. Maybe the parents had gone to just elementary school, and now their kids were going to high school. They had electricity, they had plumbing, they had good union jobs. And then kind of bang, right shortly after I graduated from high school, those good union jobs began to disappear. And people began to...
So that's the late 70s, around 77 or so?
Late 70s. And the local economy was dependent on agriculture, on forestry, on light manufacturing. So those jobs vanished. And then meth came soon after. And it just devastated a community that I care very deeply about. And I look back at my old school bus, and about a quarter of the people who were on that bus are now dead. And that reflects a national crisis. Life expectancy has gone down for 2 years in a row in the US. It will almost certainly go down for a third year. We lost 72,000 people last year from drug overdoses, more people than in the Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan wars dead in 1 year from one cause. Suicide rates are at a 30-year high. And I think that to some degree the Trump election was a cry for help, a primal scream from some of these areas. And I think that both parties have failed to address some of that desperate need. It also strikes me that one of the things we have historically cared about in America is opportunity and the idea of the American dream. And I've got to say that for a lot of those kids growing up in my hometown, that is a joke. It is a cruel joke. If you grow up in a family where the parents have dropped out of high school, where there is meth, where there is chaos in the home and people are in and out of jail, you're going to be lucky if you graduate from high school. You've got no realistic chance of going to college, of ending up in a good position. And I think we, as a society, kind of magnify that problem when our education system, which should be the escalator out of these problems, is broken.
So does your book both look at these type of issues and programs in the areas that are designed to help? Do you offer
Correct.
your own
Correct.
solutions?
I mean, it's really about the disintegration of working class communities around the country, told in part, although not entirely, through my hometown, through people I grew up with. Actually, many of them ended up coming to Idaho because the Idaho economy was booming, and so if you wanted a construction job, you tended to come to Idaho, and so a lot of them, did.
Did you come away with an overall thesis, just that we need to be paying more attention to the problems of rural Americans? Or is it?
I mean, one, certainly that we have a crisis that I don't think elites have adequately focused on, because it has tended to be concentrated in the bottom half of the population, the working class. That there are a series of what I think are policy mistakes that we made as a country. Through about the 1970s, I think things were going pretty well. We had life expectancy that was better than many OECD countries. We had the highest high school graduation rates in the world, and now we are just about at the bottom in life expectancy. American kids are 58% more likely to die by age 18 than European kids, and we rank number 61 in high school attendance. In a country that pioneered high schools. And so, one of the families that I'm close to that is, on my old school bus route, the young woman who is in that family now, she has 5 kids by 4 or 5 dads. She only went to school for 3 months total in her life. Now she's homeschooling her 5 kids. Those kids are cooked. They're just cooked. And,
And cooked to you means they don't have a future.
How are they going to get an education when their mom only went to 3 months of school and now is homeschooling them?
Some would say that the homeschooling programs that she's following on the computer, are good and will help her learn at the same time that she's learning with the children,
I'm profoundly skeptical, and it's within a culture where there has been a lot of meth in particular, and sometimes supplemented with opioids. I guess what's really striking is that you had these pretty strong families, and then you had dysfunction, drugs, job struggles, and then the cycle has been repeated, and the dysfunction spreads to the next generation. And then kids who grow up in this chaos, sometimes with sexual abuse, with, certainly just with a lot of trauma and toxic stress, who end up replicating this cycle. And it turned out that once these families the family structure is broken, it becomes a lot harder to put it back together again. But there are things, again, I do think that there are solutions, and one of the things that I find kind of horrifying is that, so in the U.S., we have, as far as we can tell, American kids and European kids have sex at about the same rates. Yet American girls are 3 times as likely to get pregnant and have a baby. And that's not rocket science. It's because American schools don't have as good sex education programs, and because we don't have as good access to reliable forms of birth control. And those programs for at-risk kids pay for themselves 7 times over. And if a 16-year-old girl gets pregnant and has a baby, that means very often she's going to drop out of school. It means that her baby is going to have a very difficult future. If you can just, help those girls who don't want to get pregnant not get pregnant, then everybody is so much better off, and yet we just put blinders on. Title X, which is the main family planning funding program, started by a Republican, back in the 60s. So funding for that in real terms has come down by more than 2/3.
How are you feeling today about the tenor of the country?
I'm actually much more optimistic than a lot of people. I have a lot of friends who are, quasi-suicidal, and I think that President Trump has tested our institutions and our norms, and that our institutions have actually responded pretty well. I think we in journalism, we blew it in 2016 during the presidential race. I think since then, journalists have acquitted themselves pretty well and have provided.
Blew it in terms of doing more investigative work into.
Yes, and TV in particular, I think, was so desperate for audiences that they kept the camera on President Trump and didn't provide adequate accountability, adequate fact-checking, adequate truth squatting, because everybody knew that if you kept the camera on him, audiences would follow. I think we should have done more of that accountability journalism. I think we've done a lot more of that since then. I think courts have also provided real accountability. Lawyers, who would have thought people would be saying nice things about lawyers in America, but lawyers are actually, have stood up against a lot of abuses. And so domestically, I think the president has been constrained in ways that I think are good. I guess the area I worry about most is foreign affairs, because intrinsically there are fewer constraints on a president internationally, and I think in North Korea, I think we were really at risk. President Trump kind of declared victory, and
didn't he say he was in love with?
He said he's in love with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. And you've been to North Korea, 3 times?
That's correct.
Okay.
And
so you're watching this very closely.
So I'm watching it very closely, but I thought that the big risk was that President Trump would launch a military strike against North Korea and start a war.
Or vice versa.
Yeah, I thought it was, frankly, that we were more of a risk starting it than, and he apparently had asked the Pentagon to study strikes. And the Pentagon, Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was, I think, kind of petrified that this was actually going to happen. And so, but now President Trump declared victory, even though North Korea is still churning out nuclear materials. And so I think that risk has moderated. I do worry about a risk of a confrontation or collision with Iran, maybe with China.
I know you're very concerned about Saudi Arabia and our relationship with that country.
I am. I think the White House, but I think indeed a lot of Americans were manipulated by Saudi Arabia. Here's a country that, has arrested women's rights activists who were the real reformers in that country. They're sitting in jail. It kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon. It provoked a crisis with Qatar. And worst of all, it went to war in Yemen and has killed thousands and thousands of Yemeni children with our weapons. And 8 million Yemenis are on the brink of starvation, completely unnecessarily. And I've been trying to get to Yemen for the last 2 years. The Saudis have blocked me from going there. But there is a generation of Yemenis who are growing up starved in ways that will affect that country for decades to come. And because we have been supporting Saudi Arabia in this, I am afraid we are complicit in that.
A viewer wants to know if you ever get frustrated. The stories you cover are complex. How do you engage people with complicated stories about far-off places when they're busy watching videos of Kanye hugging the president?
Oh,
do you get discouraged?
This is so frustrating. Recently I had columns back to back, one about Kavanaugh, one about Yemen, and Yemen, 8 million people on the brink of starvation, and it got 1/6 of the online digital readers as the Kavanaugh column. My last trip to South Sudan, it was an expensive trip. It was dangerous, and basically nobody read those columns except my mom, and that's frustrating.
You try and do it through individual stories. That's the only way you can get the attention.
You push every button you can. So I take a student with me on overseas trips to try to generate interest that way. I dragged George Clooney along on one trip to try to generate interest that way. I've done videos, done everything I can, but it's an uphill struggle to get interest about some of these global issues.
When you look back at your career, is there a particular cause or piece or series of pieces that you look at and you're still really proud of?
There are a few things that I guess I would pat myself on the back for, and in each case, they didn't involve persuading people about things. I think a columnist actually has very little persuasive power about issues that people already care about. But I think where we do have a lot of power is the ability to shine a light on something that is neglected and make people pay attention. And so in the case of Darfur in Sudan, I made 12 trips to the area, and I think there are a lot of people alive today because a bunch of us were trying to blow the whistle on genocide there. I think less effectively with the Rohingya in Myanmar. And I think that women's rights generally, especially abroad, everything from obstetric fistula, sex trafficking, that once people were aware of these issues, then that helped generate the momentum to see at least improvements. And that feels great as a journalist.
Well, great. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me, because I know how busy you are, and this is in between sessions.
Well, great to be almost home.
Yes, thank you so much.
I can almost see Oregon from here.
Come back again when your next book is out, and I look forward to talking with you about that as well. So thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You've been listening to New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof. He was the keynote speaker at the 2018 conference of the Idaho Women's Charitable Foundation, and I thank that organization for finding time in his busy schedule for this interview. Now, since our conversation, Mr. Kristof was able to get into Yemen. He wrote some searing pieces about the dire conditions there. You'll want to check those out. For more information, head to the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television, by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the Idaho Public Television Endowment.